The Meaning of History by Christopher Dawson. There is no getting away from history. Man carries it with him wherever he goes, and whether he knows it or not. His thoughts and his actions are alike influenced by his invisible burden, which is not a dead weight but an active force that impels him forward along the path he has to travel. Men may make a new start, like the Pilgrim Fathers when they landed at Plymouth Rock, but at the same time they were making history and realized very strongly that they were doing so. Long ago, not only in English but in all the Western languages, the word history has been extended from its original sense of the written or oral records of the past to cover the process with which such records deal. That is to say, the whole movement of change and persistence in time through which mankind has passed down to the present moment. Only a divine or angelic intelligence could comprehend the whole of this process in its almost infinite complexity. Yet even the savage and the completely uneducated man is not totally ignorant of it, for he is aware of the existence of the past and preserves a certain traditional knowledge of it. Between these two extremes lies the field of historical study, which is always extending its frontiers and striving towards a universality and omniscience which can never be completely realized. In modern times, the extension of this field of knowledge has been one of the most remarkable features of Western civilization. We usually think of the modern age as an age of physical science and technology, but it has also become the great age of historical research. Never since the world began has the barrier of time been pushed back so far or so fast as during the last century or 150 years. It is not merely that our knowledge of our past has been extended and deepened. What is still more remarkable is that we have reconquered great tracts of history that have been lost for thousands of years. The history of the great civilizations of the ancient world, Egypt, Sumer, and Babylon, the history of civilizations previously unknown, like that of the Hittite Empire, the history of living civilizations of the Far East that were barely glimpsed by us in the past, and finally, the history of peoples who left no written records, but whose past has been unveiled by the patient labor of the archaeologists. Although the time has not yet come, we can look forward with some confidence to the advent of a real world history, which will integrate all the different forms and stages of human culture into an intelligible unity. All this knowledge is not just an accumulation of useless archaeological lumber. It has a meaning and a value for human life today. For paradoxical though it may appear, there can be no doubt that the people who are most ignorant of history are those who are most dependent on the past, and the most enslaved to the bondage of tradition and custom. While the more we know of the past, the more free we become to choose the way we will go. Moreover, without history, we cannot understand even the world we live in. Each society and culture becomes imprisoned in the narrow confines of its present experience. The attitude of the natural, non-historical man to other cultures finds a classical expression in the most famous conversation between Jim and Huckleberry Finn. "Is a Frenchman a man? Well then, why don't he talk like a man? You answer me that." So in the past, it was only natural for uncivilized people to call themselves some name signifying man, like Eskimo, Inuit, and countless other examples, with the assumption that other peoples were somehow not altogether human. And it is not only the uncivilized peoples who have made this mistake. The Greeks themselves dismissed all the non-Greek speaking peoples as barbarians, and we ourselves, almost down to the present day, used to describe peoples whose history we knew nothing of as savages, implying thereby that they had a sort of halfway position between us and the animals. If only our predecessors 2 centuries or even a century ago had known what we know today about the history and culture of the native peoples of America and Africa, how much unnecessary waste and suffering might have been avoided. And even today, with our vastly increased resources of knowledge and understanding, we still find it difficult to apply our knowledge in the right place and at the right time. For it is usually only in a time of war that serious attempts are made to mobilize our resources of knowledge, and then only for purposes of psychological warfare and the like. Perhaps in some degree the historians and the social anthropologists are themselves not without blame for this failure. For the knowledge of history, however exhaustive, is not a panacea that will solve all of our political problems and cure all our social ills. That is the fallacy of historicism, of which we have heard so much in recent years. For during the 19th century, the intoxication of the new knowledge and the influence of evolutionary theories led men to believe that history was a kind of progressive revelation, which would gradually lead us to a wider knowledge, to larger moral values, and ultimately to universal truth. This view was propagated, on the one hand, by the French and English, and of course, American liberal philosophers, who believed in the theory of social progress, and on the other by the German philosophers, who constructed their vast systems of speculative idealism and their philosophies of history. Now, it is true enough that history leads us to wider knowledge, but only to a knowledge of historical phenomena. It does not create truth or moral values. The historical world, left to its own resources, is a world of pure relativism, and the more completely we immerse ourselves in it, the more difficult it is to see beyond it, or to grasp any ultimate truth to which we can hold fast. The only lesson we can learn from it is that which the Greeks had learnt, the lesson of humility, that man is a drop in an endless stream, but he cannot see where the stream is going. The philosophers of history have judged differently because they had their philosophy already and applied it to history, like Hegel, who saw history as the progressive revelation of the absolute spirit, because he had a metaphysical conviction that whatever is real is rational, and whatever is rational is real. Therefore, the historical process must represent a kind of dialectic by which the universal mind develops its thought. And so one does not feel that Hegel actually learnt much from history. He discovered his principle of historical dialectic by a process of philosophical speculation, and he then applied the principle, not always very happily, to the facts of history as he saw them. This kind of philosophy of history is out of fashion today, and there are very few Hegelians to be met with. But there are plenty of Marxians, and Marxism makes use of just the same principle of historical interpretation, although its dialectic is a materialistic instead of a spiritual one. And still more numerous than the Marxists are the historians and writers who possess a kind of subconscious or unacknowledged philosophy of history. Indeed, the belief in progress has been preached so long and so widely in the modern world that it has become accepted by most people as a necessary part of the democratic outlook and way of life. Nowhere is this point of view more widespread than in America, where a belief in the historic destiny of the American people as the leaders of the nations of the world towards a golden age of freedom and plenty dates back to the very origins of the Republic. No doubt, there have always been discordant voices. Indeed, the pessimism of the thoroughgoing American pessimist, like Robinson Jeffers, surpasses anything that the Old World can show. But it is just because the American pessimist is so exceptional that he is so extreme. He has to speak violently to make his voice heard. But the great mass of Americans have always had a much stronger faith in the future than any other people, and they owe this faith not to any philosophical theory or ideology like that of Marxism, but to a spiritual tradition or climate of opinion into which they have been born and with which the nation has grown up from the beginning. In this respect, it is very instructive to compare the case of America with that of Germany. The Germans are perhaps the most historically minded of all the Western peoples. No people has produced greater historians or more philosophers of history. But their concern with history is bound up with a continual anxiety about history, and their philosophies of history often seem like attempts to reassure themselves against underlying doubt. Thus, in the later 19th century, during the Bismarckian period, when the historical optimism of the nationalist historians and of the Hegelian philosophers seemed to have been justified by events, the critical attitude towards history found classical expression in the writings of Burckhardt and Nietzsche. Both of them regarded the philosophy of history as a delusion, which led either to vulgar cults of success, as with the nationalist historians, or to the secularization and nationalization of Christianity, as with the liberal Protestant theologians. Both advocated a super-historical attitude, which would be indifferent to success or failure, and looks beyond history to eternal, transcendent values. This point of view is stated most fully in Nietzsche's early essay on the use and abuse of history, from which I quote the following passage. Whoever asks his friends whether they would live the last 10 or 20 years over again will easily see which of them was born for the super-historical standpoint. They will answer no, but will give different reasons for their answer. Some will say they have consolation that the next 20 years will be better. They are the men referred to satirically by David Hume, who from the dregs of life hope to receive what the first sprightly running could not give. We will call them the historical men. Their vision of the past turns them towards the future, encourages them to persevere with life, and kindles the hope that justice will yet come and happiness is behind the mountain they are climbing. But that question, to which we have heard first answer, is capable of another, also a no, but on different grounds. It is the no of the super-historical men, who see no salvation in evolution, yet for whom the world is complete and fulfills its aim in every single moment. How could the next 10 years teach what the past 10 years were not able to teach? Whether the aim of the teaching be happiness or resignation, virtue or penance, these super-historical men are not agreed. But as against all merely historical ways of viewing the past, they are unanimous in the theory that the past and the present are one and the same, typically alike in all their diversity, and forming together a picture of eternally present types of unchangeable value and significance. Now, it is important to note that both these writers were men who accepted the necessity for a kind of religious or transcendent view of history, while they rejected the Christian faith and the Christian hope. They looked back to the ancient Greek view of life, especially, in Nietzsche's case, to the pre-Socratic thinkers and poets, above all to Heraclitus. Yet they could not entirely ignore their Christian past. They took up the Greek tragic view of life with an undercurrent of Christian ideas. Burckhardt's criticisms of the philosophers of history are not unlike those of Kierkegaard, without Kierkegaard's religious convictions, while Nietzsche was driven on his flight from history to throw aside all the values of Western culture and to embark on his attempt to transcend humanity. To sum up, the philosophers of the Enlightenment, who created the philosophy of history and the modern theory of historical progress, were not Christian thinkers. They took for granted that modern civilization had outgrown Christianity, and they believed that history and science would provide a satisfactory answer to the questions that they had inherited from the Christian tradition of the past. What was the nature and destiny of man? What were the true values of human existence, and what was the meaning of history? But the writers of whom I have just spoken realized that this was a delusion. They saw that history, by itself, is incapable of leading us to any ultimate truth. Spiritual reality transcends history, just as it transcends physical science. Yet, they continue to accept, almost without discussion, the fundamental dogma of the Enlightenment, that Christianity was, if not an exploded superstition, at least a mode of thought that modern civilization had outgrown. And therefore they were forced to adopt a negative conclusion, whether it took the form of Burckhardt's Stoic resignation or Nietzsche's ecstatic nihilism and irrationalism. But to us who are Christians, this century-long controversy on the meaning of history must seem the result of a false dilemma. We can accept Burckhardt's judgment on the failure of the ambitious attempts of 19th century philosophy to construct an ideal pattern of history out of their own inner consciousness, or to discover the course of the future of humanity by the study of its past. But we need not conclude from this failure that history has no meaning, or that man lives only in the present. No Christian can accept these views, for every Christian is a member of a super-temporal society, which has a historical existence and an eternal significance. In fact, the real reason why Western man has been so preoccupied with the need for a philosophic explanation of history, and above all with the idea of progress, that is, the belief that mankind is continually advancing through the ages and advancing to some goal, is because Christianity has first put these ideas into his head, and he still clings to them even when he has lost his faith. This point becomes very clear when we consider the original point of departure from the German philosophizing on history. The first important work that had a profound influence on the thought of the German Enlightenment was Lessing's essay on the education of the human race, published in 1780, as this is simply a theodicy, or a theory of divine revelation, taken over bodily from Christian sources, as adapted to a rationalist or idealist public. Seen in this way, Christianity has had an incalculable influence on Western history, because it has formed the minds of the historians, the men who wrote our histories, and the philosophers, the men who reflected on the meaning of history, from St. Augustine and the Venerable Bede to Hegel and Rank and Acton.